The strange, the forgotten, the downright ugly. America has had its fair share of head-scratching automotive misfires over the decades. Let's dive deep into the 12 ugliest American cars ever built, complete with horror stories, design blunders, and the kind of misguided styling that makes you say, what were they thinking? The 2001 Chrysler Sebring convertible is one of those cars that somehow became ubiquitous while remaining universally underwhelming. For much of the early 2000s, it was nearly impossible to travel to a sunny vacation destination, Orlando, San Diego, Las Vegas, without spotting one parked at a beachfront motel or idling outside an airport rental lot. It was the convertible you didn't choose, but ended up with. A car that promised the romance of open-top cruising, but often delivered only sunburn, wind noise, and a vaguely plasticky scent that no amount of Armor All could mask. On paper, the Sebring convertible seemed like it might have something to offer. 4 seats, a folding soft top, a 2.7-liter V6 with 200 horsepower, and vaguely European-sounding aspirations thanks to its platform sharing with the Chrysler Cirrus and Dodge Stratus. It was meant to be affordable elegance for middle America, a way to feel the wind in your hair without breaking the bank. But what Chrysler delivered was less a poor man's Mercedes and more a confused cocktail of rental-grade compromises and midlife crisis regrets. Visually, the Sebring looked like a car in witness protection. The front end sagged like it was tired of existing, the rear flared out like a bloated afterthought, and the proportions had all the harmony of a half-melted bar of soap. The wheel arches seemed embarrassed to contain their contents. And the trim, oh, the trim, seemed to wage a personal war against the sun. Owners in the South reported pieces curling like potato chips on hot days. The dashboard was a cornucopia of squeaks, creaks, and brittle switchgear that turned driving into a sensory assault. Driving it was no redemption either. The chassis felt like it had the rigidity of a boiled noodle, thanks to the lack of structural reinforcement that should have been there to compensate for the missing roof. Over bumps, it flexed. In corners, it heaved and protested. The steering was light but vague, offering all the communication of a tired telemarketer. Understeer arrived early and stuck around like a bad guest. The ride was mushy, the handling forgettable, and the brake pedal gave you the sensation of trying to slow down with a memory foam slipper. Inside, it didn't get better. While Chrysler touted the Sebring's ability to seat 4 adults, what they didn't mention was that anyone taller than 5'10" in the back would be making friends with the convertible top's frame. The seats were covered in materials that looked like leather from a distance, felt like vinyl up close, and aged like milk in the summer sun. The ergonomics were abstract, and the stereo, even when upgraded, sounded like it was broadcasting from inside a cardboard box. But what truly defined the 2001 Sebring convertible wasn't its technical failings. It was the cultural stigma. It became shorthand for generic, uninspired motoring. The kind of car you inherited or got stuck with in the rental lane when the Mustang convertibles were gone. It didn't command pride. It didn't suggest enthusiasm. As one former owner lamented, "It felt like my car wanted to hide behind a bush." Another recalled, "It was like the automotive version of flip-flops, fine for the beach, but God help you if you had to go anywhere serious." Yet oddly enough, the Sebring convertible sold well for years. Why? Because it was cheap, because it had a soft top, because for a brief moment, it was one of the few affordable convertibles that wasn't a 2-seater or a Miata. It filled a niche, poorly, but thoroughly, and in that, it became a kind of tragic success. It was a car no one aspired to own, but many ended up driving. A car that seemed to whisper, well, it's better than walking. Today, the 2001 Sebring convertible is mostly forgotten, left to bake in third-owner driveways, or limp through Craigslist listings for $1,000 and needs work. It's not a classic, it's not collectible, but it's unforgettable in its own way. A car that tried to be something, and in failing became a symbol of early 2000s mediocrity. And for that reason alone, it deserves its strange little footnote in automotive history. The 1973 Buick Century Luxus arrived at the apex of Detroit's love affair with bloated grandeur, a time when the answer to every question seemed to be add more vinyl, more chrome, and definitely more fake wood. Buick's marketing team positioned the Century Luxus as an upscale alternative to your average personal luxury coupe or sedan, offering continental styling and comfort aimed at buyers who wanted Cadillac taste on an Oldsmobile budget. But what they delivered was a rolling contradiction, a vehicle that tried to be stately and stylish, but ended up resembling a couch on wheels with a grille. At a glance, the Century Luxus was a visual time capsule of 1970s automotive fashion gone slightly mad. Those distinctive colonnade B-pillars, thick, square, and framed like a jailhouse window, were supposed to provide a sense of open-air driving with more structure after the demise of the true hardtop. But in practice, they just made rear-seat passengers feel like they were looking out of a submarine. The mandatory vinyl roof often came in Landau style, splitting the car in awkward fashion, and was frequently paired with the sort of faux wood side paneling that wouldn't look out of place in your grandmother's basement. Add in wheel skirts, deeply inset quad headlights, and chrome accents so thick you could see your reflection in them from across the parking lot, and the result was a car that screamed status, but only if your definition of status included a membership at a moose lodge. The Luxus name implied something exotic, European, refined, but there was nothing understated about the Century Luxus. This was Buick's interpretation of luxury, circa 1973. Plush velour seats with patterns that looked like hotel carpeting, a dash made of brittle plastic and fake burled wood, and dials that felt like they were designed by the same people who made home thermostats. The steering wheel was massive and thin, giving the sensation of piloting a barge rather than a car. One auto journalist quipped that the Luxus looked like it came with a prescription for arthritis, and the ergonomics backed it up. From the low-slung driving position to the spindly controls that required dexterity only someone with supple wrists could manage. Performance? Well, it was the 1970s. Depending on the trim, you could get anything from a lethargic 231 cubic inch V6 to a lumbering 455 cubic inch V8. But even the biggest engine struggled under the weight of the Luxus' nearly 2-ton mass. The car wasn't so much quick as it was persistent. It would eventually get where it was going, preferably in a straight line, while absorbing every pothole in its path with the grace of a worn La-Z-Boy recliner. Handling was best described as nautical. Braking required planning. Fuel economy hovered somewhere between dismal and bring a second paycheck. And yet, despite its flaws, the Century Luxus sold decently. Not because it was excellent, but because it offered a particular kind of American comfort that appealed to an older, conservative buyer. It wasn't trying to compete with European sedans. It was trying to give you a Buick that felt more Cadillac than Chevrolet. It worked for retirees, for middle managers in leisure suits, and for anyone who still thought AM/FM radios were the height of in-car technology. Today, the 1973 Century Luxus is almost entirely forgotten. It has no performance heritage, no pop culture cachet, and few collectors mourn its disappearance. Most ended their lives as trade-ins, demolition derby participants, or the forgotten rides of people who still had green shag carpeting in their living rooms. But in its own polyester-clad way, the Century Luxus represented an era, one of softness, of style over substance, and of Detroit trying to sell an image of luxury that was increasingly out of touch with a changing world. It may not be remembered fondly, but it is remembered, and that counts for something. The 1980 Dodge Mirada was a car born into a moment of confusion, both for Dodge and the American car industry as a whole. By the early 1980s, muscle was dead, chrome was dying, and personal luxury coupes were clinging to relevance in an era of downsizing, smog controls, and gas lines. Dodge wanted something stylish, something that could evoke class without costing Cadillac money, and something that could compete with the likes of the Ford Thunderbird or the Chevy Monte Carlo. What they built instead was the Mirada, a strange cocktail of old ideas, forced glamour, and mechanical leftovers dressed in ill-fitting tuxedo trim. From the front, the Mirada tried hard, too hard. It wore an absurdly large vertical fake grille, reminiscent of a Rolls-Royce if you squinted, hard, in the dark. while also slightly concussed. The design aimed for opulence but landed somewhere closer to a department store mannequin. All presentation, no authenticity. Some versions came with a half-vinyl roof and opera windows, while others had a Landau bar as if to remind you that, yes, this was still a personal luxury vehicle, even if it looked like it had been styled during a blackout. The back end sloped down suddenly in a bizarre, flattened arc. Not so much fastback as last-minute deletion. It gave the car a chopped, tail-heavy stance that looked like it was designed with leftover sheet metal. Inside, the Dodge Mirada continued its campaign of awkwardness. The dashboard and trim panels were a Frankenstein's mix of hard plastics and fake wood grain. In top trims, you could get a crushed velour interior that might have been acceptable in a budget Las Vegas lounge, but was downright laughable in a car marketed as classy. The seats were overstuffed and undersupported. Gauges were squinty and recessed like they were hiding from their own failure. It all felt like the decor in a regional bus terminal had been accidentally sewn into a car. Mechanically, the Mirada was stuck between decades. Built on Chrysler's aging J-body platform, a derivative of the even older F-body used for the Aspen and Volare, it was hardly cutting edge. The suspension was primitive, the ride was floaty and vague, and steering felt like turning a pot of oatmeal with a yardstick. Base models came with a tired 3.7L slant 6 engine, but buyers could option up to a 318 or 360 cubic inch V8, albeit neutered by early 80s emissions regulations and producing horsepower numbers that wouldn't scare a modern minivan. Even with a V8, it felt slow, especially as the smog equipment choked the life out of every engine in Chrysler's stable. One auto writer remarked that the Mirada sounded fast but moved like a wet mattress. In theory, there was a sporty version called the CMX, with a simulated convertible roof and other laughable dress-up pieces meant to suggest athleticism. Dodge even tried to promote it as a potential NASCAR racer, and one was built for Richard Petty, but even the King reportedly disliked it and quickly moved on. That PR stunt went nowhere, just like most Miradas. The Mirada was produced through 1983, but it made little impact. Sales were tepid, marketing was confused, and the car itself never found an identity. It was too soft to be sporty, too cheap to be luxurious, and too awkward to be remembered fondly. By the mid-'80s, it was gone, a footnote in Chrysler's troubled era before Leah Iacocca's K-car revolution. Today, the Mirada exists mostly in blurry childhood memories, junkyard sightings, or obscure corners of Craigslist. It's not collectible, it's not fast, and it's certainly not beautiful. But it's an unintentional time capsule of an industry grasping for direction and a reminder of when style was faked, substance was optional, and mediocrity came standard with white walls and a Landau roof. In short, the Mirada wasn't just obscure, it was forgettable by design. The 2002 Saturn Ion Coupe was a bizarre attempt at being edgy during a time when General Motors was desperately trying to keep Saturn relevant, or even coherent. As a successor to the Saturn S-Series, which had at least carved out a niche in the 90s as a sensible, plastic-paneled underdog, the Ion was supposed to usher in a new era of design and youth-oriented innovation. Instead, it became a rolling lesson in what happens when good ideas are filtered through layers of bad decision-making, outdated GM platforms, and cost-cutting gone nuclear. The Ion Coupe's headline feature was those strange, rear-hinged clamshell suicide doors, a rarity in the compact car world. They were supposed to make the back seat more accessible, a clever way to add practicality to a two-door. In practice, they looked cool until you tried using them. You couldn't open them unless the front doors were open, which turned loading passengers into a two-step dance routine. Worse, the doors felt like they were made of recycled patio furniture. Lightweight, wobbly, and questionably attached. One test driver at the time described shutting the rear door as like trying to close a Rubbermaid container on a windy day. Visually, the Ion Coupe was a mess of curves and clashing angles. From the front, it resembled a bar of soap with headlights. From the rear, it looked like someone had modeled it after a melted toaster. It was plasticky in every sense, not just in feel but in appearance, with huge panel gaps, oddly bulging fenders, and a stance that was somehow both too tall and too stubby. Despite its coupe name, it didn't exude sportiness. Even Saturn diehards admitted it looked like it was drawn by someone who'd only seen cars on television. Inside, the Ion made another bold misstep. The instrument cluster was mounted in the center of the dash, not in front of the driver. Saturn claimed it helped visibility. Owners claimed it caused neck cramps. The interior plastics were among the worst in any GM vehicle of the era. Brittle, chalky, and destined to rattle like a drawer full of marbles. The steering felt disconnected. The seats were thin and unsupportive, and the whole cabin reeked of early 2000s rental fleet malaise. Mechanically, the Ion wasn't much better. Base models got a 2.2-liter Ecotec engine that was competent but uninspired, paired to either a 5-speed manual or, infamously, a 5-speed automatic built by an obscure German supplier. That transmission, the Getrag VT25E, was notorious for rough shifts, poor reliability, and a tendency to confuse even experienced drivers. Performance was sluggish, and the coupe's handling felt twitchy and uncertain. It was neither a canyon carver nor a confident commuter. It was a compromise on 4 wheels. Even the Redline Performance version, introduced later with a supercharged engine and stiffer suspension, couldn't save the Ion's reputation. Critics said it felt like putting a turbocharger on a wet cardboard box. Fast in a straight line, but still cheap, noisy, and awkward in every other way. The Saturn Ion Coupe, especially with those odd rear doors, was a case study in missed potential. On paper, it had innovative touches: suicide access doors, polymer panels that resisted dings, and youthful styling cues. But in execution, it felt half-baked and hastily assembled. It never found an audience, never sparked excitement, and ultimately served as a sad harbinger of Saturn's collapse. By 2007, Saturn had dropped the Ion entirely in favor of the more refined Astra. But it was too late. The damage was done. Today, the Ion Coupe lives on mostly in worst car lists, junkyards, and the memories of people who once owned one and have spent years trying to forget it. The clamshell doors may have been cool in theory, but the Ion Coupe proved that design gimmicks can't save a car that feels like it was built in a panic. The 1960 Edsel Ranger was more than just a failed car. It was a melancholy postscript to one of the most infamous and expensive collapses in American automotive history. Unlike the brazen, chrome-laden spectacle of the original 1958 Edsel, the 1960 Ranger didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a whimper, the exhausted product of a company that had already given up. It was no longer an experiment in bold design or a bid to fill an untapped market niche. It was a corporate afterthought, a placeholder built to fulfill already signed dealer agreements and little more. What was once touted as the car of the future had, by 1960, become a fading ghost, bland, lifeless, and haunted by the magnitude of its own failure. The original Edsel had launched with wild ambition and an equally wild grille that split public opinion like a knife through a grapefruit. Ford had created an entirely new division, a new dealer network, and invested hundreds of millions of dollars in 1950s money to bring the Edsel to life. But poor timing, overblown expectations, and unfocused marketing ensured its downfall. By 1960, Ford had already announced the death of the Edsel brand. Still, for contractual reasons, it was forced to deliver a few last cars. And so the 1960 Edsel Ranger was born. If born is the right word for something that rolled off the line already condemned to oblivion. Visually, the 1960 Ranger was the antithesis of the Edsel ethos. It lacked personality, lacked character, and lacked the very risk-taking that had defined its infamous predecessors. It borrowed its entire body from the Ford Galaxy and Fairlane. And while it retained a few mildly unique elements, they were so subtle as to be pointless. The once notorious vertical horse-collar grille, the design element that had made the 1958 Edsel instantly recognizable and mockable, was now gone, replaced with an anonymous horizontal affair that looked cobbled together from a parts bin at 4:59 p.m. on a Friday. But even in its anonymity, the 1960 Ranger managed to be awkward. The front end was strangely proportioned, as though it were designed for a different car entirely. The headlights seemed to drift outward while the center of the grille stagnated in defeat. The side profile looked truncated and uninspired, and the rear end, with its boomerang taillights and too small bumper, came off like a rushed afterthought. From any angle, the Ranger appeared to be a car struggling to pretend it had purpose. The 1960 Edsel looked like the body had been dressed in someone else's clothes, said one critic, and none of them fit. Inside, things were equally dispirited. While the earlier Edsels had boasted imaginative dashboards and quirky interior flourishes, the 1960 Ranger gave up the ghost entirely. It reused much of the Ford Fairlane's interior with minor trim changes and a few token differences in badging. The space was comfortable enough, but there was no spark, no look-at-me flair, no innovation, and certainly no reason to choose it over the better-selling Fords or Mercurys on which it was based. Even the Ranger name, which once conjured ideas of rugged adventure, now sounded like a sad corporate echo, bouncing around an empty conference room at Ford headquarters. Mechanically, the 1960 Ranger wasn't bad, but that wasn't nearly enough to save it. Base models came with a 292 cubic inch V8 making around 185 horsepower, while higher trims offered the larger 352 V8 making up to 300. Paired with either a manual or a 3-speed automatic transmission, the Ranger could cruise comfortably, but performance was sedate. It was competent, but so was everything else. And most of them weren't carrying the baggage of a ruined brand. Fuel economy was poor even by the day's standards, and handling was best described as nautical. But really, no one bought a 1960 Ranger expecting excitement. The only real surprises came from how utterly indifferent the entire package was. Sales figures tell the final story. Ford produced just 2,846 Edsels for the 1960 model year before pulling the plug on the line, Cimarron, and the brand in November 1959, barely halfway into the model year. It remains one of the lowest production runs for a mass-market American car, and today it's the rarest of all Edsel models. But rarity, in this case, doesn't translate to value. While early Edsels have earned some collectible interest due to their infamous styling and dramatic backstory, the 1960 Ranger remains a largely forgotten relic. A car without a fan base, a story without an ending worth retelling. In many ways, the 1960 Edsel Ranger represents something deeper than a failed car. It's a symbol of defeated ambition, of what happens when a bold idea collapses and the final chapter is written not in defiance or redemption, but in resignation. It's the kind of car that rolls past you in a forgotten barnyard or a dusty estate sale, and you pause, not out of admiration but out of curiosity. The 1985 Cadillac Cimarron wasn't merely a bad car, it was a corporate sin, a monument to cynicism dressed in plastic chrome. In a decade when brand loyalty still mattered and Cadillac meant something, GM attempted the automotive equivalent of a bait and switch. Take a humble Chevrolet Cavalier, stiffen the suspension slightly, glue on some veneer trim and leather, and call it a Cadillac. The result was not just a failure, it was a betrayal of trust that sent shockwaves through the Cadillac nameplate for years. At first glance, the Cimarron seemed ordinary, which was exactly the problem. It looked like any other J-body compact from GM's lineup, a basic front-wheel drive economy car with square headlights, straight lines, and an upright stance. There was no sweeping chrome, no dignified long hood or tapering rear deck. This was not the kind of vehicle that one expected to see parked in front of a country club or gliding silently down a boulevard. This was a car that looked best outside a Greyhound station, yet GM had the audacity to market it as a full-fledged Cadillac. In 1982, when it first debuted, Cadillac was already facing pressure from German imports like BMW and Mercedes-Benz, whose compact luxury sedans were redefining what prestige meant. GM panicked. Rather than engineer a true small Cadillac from the ground up, they rushed out the Cimarron, hoping to meet the market halfway. But they didn't just cut corners, they built the car entirely from them. By 1980, 3 years into its life, the Cimarron had become the automotive punchline of the era. Though Cadillac had made incremental improvements, a 2.8-liter V6 became available, and equipment and packages got fancier. The underlying deception remained. The dashboard was lifted almost directly from its Cavalier twin, but now with imitation wood grain and a smattering of gold emblems. The leather seats felt thin and plasticky. The steering wheel was a corporate parts bin carryover, and under the badge, it was clear that this was no standard of the world. It was barely standard at all. Driving the 1985 Cimarron was an exercise in disappointment. The V6 engine delivered modest performance, but not enough to justify the car's premium price tag, which hovered dangerously close to that of a fully loaded BMW 3 Series. The suspension had been tightened, in name only. It still wallowed in corners and punished its driver over broken pavement. The steering lacked precision, and the braking feel was mushy at best. Road and Track famously wrote that the Cimarron did more to damage Cadillac's reputation than any other car in its history. Buyers who took the bait often regretted it. One disgruntled owner recalled, "It felt like the car itself was embarrassed to be a Cadillac. Every time I started it, it sighed." Another famously quipped, "It looked like a prom corsage on a fast food tray." The interior creaked, the trim faded, and the badge held no weight in valet lines or country club driveways. Worse still, it was often outsold by its cheaper, less pretentious Chevy sibling, for good reason. The Cimarron wasn't just a design failure or a marketing flop. It was a cultural touchstone, the clearest sign that GM had lost its way. Cadillac, a brand once synonymous with American luxury and innovation, had willingly slapped its crest on a compact platform meant for budget-conscious commuters. The damage was severe. Cadillac would spend the next 2 decades trying to claw its way back toward relevance, and many industry analysts still point to the Cimarron as the beginning of that long, painful fall. And yet, the Cimarron endures, not in reverence but in infamy. Today it's a staple of worst car lists and cautionary tales, often grouped with the likes of the Yugo or the Ford Pinto. You won't find one at a concourse, and most have long since rusted away or been cannibalized for cavalier parts. But its story lives on, a permanent footnote in the annals of automotive misjudgment. The 1985 Cadillac Cimarron wasn't just bad, it was a betrayal wearing a Cadillac crest. And while time has softened the memory of many automotive missteps, this one still stings. Because it wasn't just the car that failed, it was the promise behind the badge. The 1975 Chevrolet Monza Town Coupe was a peculiar answer to a question no one had asked. Conceived during a time when American automakers were desperately trying to adapt to the oil crisis, shifting safety regulations, and a growing appetite for European styling, the Monza was supposed to be Chevrolet's small, sophisticated, fuel-efficient coupe, a domestic rival to the increasingly popular imports from Germany and Japan. But what arrived was a design that felt like a pastiche of conflicting ideas, dressed in trim packages that were more costume than couture. At its core, the Monza Town Coupe was based on the same H-body platform as the Chevrolet Vega, which didn't exactly start things off on a strong foundation. It inherited many of the Vega's structural and mechanical flaws, including questionable durability and underwhelming performance. But GM never wanted to give up on a nameplate without throwing every badge and trim gimmick at the wall, decided to offer the Monza in a supposedly more upscale version called the Town Coupe. That E at the end of town was meant to imply class. What it actually signaled was a corporate attempt to polish a very tired concept. Visually, the Monza Town Coupe was a study in awkward proportions. While the Monza hatchback had a sportier, fastback profile inspired, laughably, by the Ferrari 365 GTC4, the Town Coupe looked like someone had tried to shrink a formal luxury sedan into a compact footprint, but ran out of time and sense halfway through. The result was a stubby body with a tall, flat rear deck and an oddly sloping rear pillar that made rear visibility worse and the car's silhouette more confused. Chevy tried to class it up with optional vinyl roofs, opera windows, and porthole-shaped rear glass. But these design choices only accentuated the incoherence. The front end, shared with other Monza variants, wasn't particularly offensive, but it didn't inspire confidence either. It was as if GM designers looked at a Ford Granada and then decided to make it a little smaller and slightly sadder. The body lines lacked cohesion, and the overall effect was that of a Vega trying to sneak into a cocktail party wearing its dad's blazer. It looked like it was designed by committee, each one blindfolded, joked a former owner, summing up the car's aesthetic shortcomings in one bitter sentence. Under the hood, the Monza Town Coupe wasn't a performer. Despite the option of a V8 engine, a 262 cubic inch small block, later replaced by a 305. These engines gave the car decent grunt in a straight line, but did little to help the handling, which remained wallowy and imprecise. The car was nose-heavy and underbraked, and the steering provided all the feedback of a damp sponge. It may have had European aspirations, but none of the precision or agility that phrase implied. Compared to something like a BMW 320i or even a Datsun 610, the Monza felt cheap, bloated, and indifferent. The interior was similarly confused, an attempt at luxury that came across as downmarket despite the padded dash and simulated wood grain. The seats were often vinyl-covered, unsupportive, and offered minimal adjustability. Road noise was prominent, build quality was inconsistent, and though there were moments of interesting touches, like certain gauge cluster layouts or upholstery options, none of it came together in a way that would make the car feel truly premium or even well thought out. But perhaps the most damning thing about the Monza Town Coupe was that it didn't know what it wanted to be. It wasn't efficient enough to attract the economy-minded, stylish enough to woo the young and upwardly mobile, or refined enough to steal sales from the imports. It tried to be too many things and ended up being none of them. Today, the 1975 Monza Town Coupe has largely vanished from public memory, rarely showing up even in worst car lists. Not because it was particularly heinous, but because it was so utterly forgettable. It never gathered a cult following, never became a sleeper, and never inspired nostalgic affection. It simply existed, then faded. A footnote in GM's long saga of missed opportunities and misread market signals. In hindsight, the Monza Town Coupe is a case study in how not to do upmarket. It tried to mimic class with badges and chrome trim, but under the makeup, it was still a Vega in an ill-fitting tuxedo. A car with no real sense of purpose, born of compromise, committee design, and corporate panic. The 1990 Chevrolet Lumina APV, often affectionately called the Dustbuster van, was one of those vehicles that left an indelible mark, not because it was good, but because it was so dramatically different that it couldn't be ignored. While the rest of the automotive world embraced more traditional minivan designs, GM, in its infinite wisdom, decided to throw conventionality out the window and create something that looked like it came from an entirely different planet. It wasn't just a minivan, it was a minivan designed with the ethos of a spaceship and the aesthetic of an appliance. The Lumina APV's most notable feature was its radical aerodynamic body. GM aimed for futuristic, sleek design, but instead it ended up with a form that looked like it had been sculpted by an overzealous wind tunnel experiment. The sharply sloping nose, combined with an oddly aggressive front end, made it appear as though the van had been designed with no concern for pedestrian safety or human perception. The front bumper jutted out like an angry beak, and the deep-set windshield seemed to consume the van's entire front end. If you looked at it long enough, you could almost hear the wind rushing over its plastic surface, as though it was already in motion, defying the laws of physics. Its nickname, the Dustbuster, wasn't just a nod to its unconventional shape. It was a perfect description of its visual impact. The van's design was so distinct and awkward that it became an almost iconic part of American automotive culture. The moniker evoked the image of an overcomplicated household appliance rather than a vehicle, reinforcing the idea that GM's attempt at modern was more like a blip of eccentricity than anything elegant or stylish. The van's bulging plastic cladding, which wrapped around the body like a layer of protective armor, only made the vehicle look even more odd. This was the 1990s equivalent of putting a cheap plastic shell over a toaster and calling it futuristic. Inside, the Lumina APV tried to make amends for its awkward exterior with practicality. It had a spacious cabin, ample room for passengers, and surprisingly good visibility despite the intimidating front end. But the dashboard and controls felt as though they had been created using the same philosophy that led to the van's design. Overly complex for no apparent reason. Some features, like the sliding rear doors and modular seating, were clever, but they didn't offset the oddity of the van's shape and build. One of the most common complaints from owners was the van's driving dynamics, or rather the lack thereof. The sloping nose may have looked aerodynamic, but it created a driving experience where visibility was poor, and it felt as though the driver was constantly trying to figure out where the front of the vehicle ended. You couldn't see where the hood ended, one owner recalled. Backing out of the garage was a leap of faith. It wasn't just about looks. The Lumina APV's weird shape affected its performance and ergonomics, as it had an unsettling tendency to be both top-heavy and underpowered. Even its handling was compromised by the strange shape that felt alien to the average minivan driver. The engine options weren't exactly thrilling either. The Lumina APV was powered by a 3.1-liter V6, which was common for the era, but it didn't provide the power or performance expected from a family vehicle. Combined with the awkward design, it gave the impression that GM had created a minivan that was more concerned with appearing futuristic than actually functioning as a useful family hauler. Despite its many shortcomings, the Lumina APV did find a niche in the market. It was one of the first minivans to try something completely different, and for a brief period, it caught the attention of those looking for something unique in the minivan world. GM's gamble on nonconformity didn't pay off, though, as the van's unorthodox design proved to be a major turnoff for the average consumer. It was eventually discontinued, and the world moved on to more conventional, rounded, and friendly-looking minivans. The Lumina APV remains an oddball in automotive history, its eccentricities and odd design making it a symbol of 1990s automotive experimentation gone wrong. Its Dustbuster nickname became a shorthand for its strange, hard-to-love appearance. But in its misfired ambition, it also became a beloved curiosity for those who appreciate cars that dared to be different, even when it was clear that they were never going to fit into the mainstream. For all its flaws, the Lumina APV still represents a moment in time when automakers weren't afraid to think outside the box, even if it meant producing one of the strangest vehicles to ever hit the road. The 1961 Plymouth Fury stands as one of the most visually arresting and frankly unsettling examples of automotive design. It was a product of its time, an era when automakers were obsessed with excess, speed, and an air of futuristic ambition. The car was more than just a vehicle. It was a statement, an embodiment of the jet age that fueled the dreams of post-Wowie America. But in trying to capture the bold spirit of that era, the Fury veered into the realm of the bizarre. At first glance, the Fury looks like it's caught in a state of eternal alarm. The tail fins, which had already become a symbol of American cars in the late 50s, are now exaggerated to the point of absurdity, stretching out like wings that belong on a fighter jet, not a sedan. These fins dominate the rear of the car, making the car seem as though it's trying to take flight, or at least escape the 20th century's obsession with exaggerated styling. They're not just fins, they're towering statements of automotive bravado that give the Fury a sense of imminent flight, as if the car is preparing to break free of the road entirely. The front of the Fury is no less dramatic. The stacked headlights sit aggressively within the car's sloping, snarling grille, creating the unsettling illusion of a grimacing face. It's as if the car is always angry, forever caught in a scream, its angular lines and sharp edges adding to the visual chaos. The front grille is wide and gaping, like a mouth ready to swallow anything in its path, further amplifying the Fury's confrontational stance. It's a design that demands attention, and it certainly gets it, but for all the wrong reasons. There's something almost comical about the Fury's appearance, as if the designers had decided that subtlety was for the weak and that only the most eye-popping, outlandish car could represent Plymouth's vision of the future. The jet age ambition is apparent. The car's sharp lines and sweeping forms scream modernity and speed. Yet in retrospect, that very ambition clashes with the car's overwrought styling, creating a look that is at once impressive and jarring. Inside, the Fury was a mix of opulence and chaos, much like the exterior. The seats were plush, the dashboards were gleaming with chrome, and the general sense of luxury was undeniable. But so was the sense that the whole thing was over-designed. The steering wheel, for instance, was large and unwieldy, its chrome accents flashy to the point of distraction. The interior felt like it was trying to be futuristic and high-end, but it often came across as gaudy and excessive, much like the car's exterior. It's as if the designers threw every idea they had into the mix, hoping something would stick. Under the hood, the 1961 Plymouth Fury came with a range of engines, including the 383 cubic inch V8, which provided decent power for its time. But despite its potential for performance, the Fury's bloated design often overshadowed its mechanical capabilities. It was a heavy car, with a wheelbase that made maneuvering in tight spaces a chore. On the road, it was a cruiser, built more for straight-line power than agile cornering, but its performance, while respectable, was never enough to overcome the car's visual quirks. Today, the 1961 Plymouth Fury is a rare sight, and for good reason. It was a car that tried too hard to make a statement, to embody the brashness of its time, and in doing so became an automotive curiosity. It's a symbol of an era when excess was embraced without question, when style was measured by how loudly it could shout. While the Fury has its fans, those who appreciate its place in automotive history and its larger-than-life design, it's also a car that serves as a reminder of why over-the-top styling isn't always the best route. It was a symbol of a time when American automakers felt the need to go big, and often they went too big. The Fury is a testament to that boldness, and a warning to those who might be tempted to build cars with more style than substance. For all its boldness, its panicked face, and its oversized fins, the 1961 Plymouth Fury is a car that few could love for anything other than its sheer, unrelenting weirdness. The 1974 Mustang II Ghia is often regarded as one of the most controversial entries in Mustang history, a car that seemed to signal the end of the Mustang's muscle car era. Ford, in the wake of the 1973 oil crisis, found itself scrambling to adapt. The original iconic Mustang had grown in size and power, reflecting the muscle car culture of the 60s, but with fuel prices skyrocketing and emissions standards tightening, the world was shifting away from the larger, thirstier machines. Ford's solution? A smaller, more fuel-efficient Mustang, one that could cater to a new breed of buyers looking for something more practical. Unfortunately, the result was the 1974 Mustang II Ghia, a car that tried to embody luxury and compactness, but ended up falling short of both. At first glance, the Mustang II Ghia was a jarring sight for Mustang enthusiasts. Gone was the aggressive stance of the previous models, replaced by a shrunken, soft, and awkward silhouette. The once vibrant muscle car had become a compact luxury coupe, or at least Ford tried to make it look like one. The Ghia trim, which was supposed to add some sophistication, simply highlighted how out of place the entire car seemed. With its vinyl roof, chrome accents, and opera windows, those small, rectangular side windows often seen on luxury cars of the era, the Mustang II Ghia looked like it was trying to wear a costume it couldn't pull off. It felt more like a generic personal luxury car than a genuine performance machine. The vinyl roof, in particular, gave the car an air of suburban excess, as if it had been borrowed from the driveway of someone who was more interested in impressing neighbors than tearing up the streets. "It looked like my aunt's living room on wheels," one collector lamented, perfectly capturing the sense of confusion surrounding the car's identity. This was not a Mustang anymore. This was a Mustang that had traded in its muscle for the comforts of suburban mediocrity. The car's performance reflected the same confused identity. Under the hood, Ford's options were underwhelming, with engines that were a far cry from the roar of the classic V8s that had made the Mustang famous. The Mustang II Ghia's powertrains were largely small, four-cylinder engines that offered little more than basic transportation. Even the optional V8 felt out of place, a mere shadow of the engine's former glory. While it offered a bit more horsepower, it was still bogged down by the car's excessive weight and awkward design. What was once a performance car now felt like an uninspiring commuter vehicle with a sports car badge. The interior was no better. Ford's attempt at creating a luxury experience was half-hearted at best. While it featured plush seating and faux wood trim, it never felt refined. The Ghia's dashboard, complete with its oversized, dated instruments, looked more like something out of an outdated sedan than a car with performance heritage. It was clear that Ford's heart wasn't in it, and neither were the buyers. While the Mustang II Ghia sold well initially, Ford was tapping into the demand for compact, fuel-efficient cars. It did so at the cost of everything that made the Mustang great. The muscle was gone, replaced by a sense of nostalgia for an era that had passed. Critics and fans alike derided it as a betrayal of the Mustang's legacy. For Mustang lovers, this was the darkest timeline. A car that bore the Mustang name, but none of its spirit. Today, the 1974 Mustang II Ghia is mostly forgotten or viewed with bemusement by car enthusiasts. While it may have found a niche audience in its day, it remains a symbol of the compromises automakers were forced to make in the wake of the oil crisis. It's not a car remembered for its performance or design, but rather for how it represented a moment in time when the American muscle car was, quite literally, downsized. It was a Mustang, but not as anyone had ever imagined it. The Mustang II Ghia was the Mustang that had lost its way. The 2001 Pontiac Aztek is an icon of automotive design failure, a car that earned its place in history not through innovation or style, but through its sheer, unapologetic ugliness. Born out of Pontiac's desire to push boundaries and break from the traditional mold of SUVs and minivans, the Aztek was meant to be edgy and avant-garde. Instead, it became a symbol of everything that went wrong with early 2000s car design, earning a legendary reputation for its awkward proportions and unsightly features. At first glance, the Aztek looked like it had been designed in a rush, as if multiple car styles had collided in a single confused shape. The front end was a mishmash of angles and slashes, giving the vehicle an angry, disjointed look. The roofline was awkwardly elevated, while the rear end featured bizarre proportions that seemed more like an afterthought than part of a cohesive design. The plastic cladding, which was intended to give the Aztek a rugged, adventurous feel, instead appeared as if it had been slapped on without much thought, almost like the designers had found extra plastic pieces lying around the factory and decided to glue them onto the car. The result was a Frankenstein's monster of automotive ideas. Part minivan, part SUV, part something that just didn't belong anywhere. Despite its lofty goals, the Aztek was everything but cohesive. The sides of the vehicle were dominated by huge, unrefined panels, and the rear was awkwardly truncated, creating a stumpy silhouette that looked more like a P than an actual car. The vehicle's strange proportions made it look as though it had been squished or stretched out of shape. It was hard to look at and almost impossible to unsee once you'd laid eyes on it. Even the bold, futuristic headlights seemed out of place, as though they were trying to cover up the rest of the design's flaws with a flashy face. But perhaps the most unfortunate part of the Aztek's legacy was its interior. While the design was bland and functional, it offered little to redeem the exterior chaos. The seats were comfortable and the layout was user-friendly, but there was nothing about it that could make you forget the fact that you were driving a car that looked like it had fallen out of an alternate dimension. Pontiac's ambitious, edgy vision ultimately didn't resonate with buyers. The Aztek was so bizarrely unattractive that it quickly became the butt of countless jokes. Its appearance was so bad that it overshadowed any other merits the vehicle might have had. Even the late, great Walter White couldn't salvage its reputation, despite his infamous role in the TV show Breaking Bad, where the character's use of the Aztek became somewhat of a cult fascination. As one owner quipped, the Aztek was the only car that looked better from the interior of a garage. Its sales numbers reflected the public's lack of interest, and it soon became a symbol of automotive missteps. It was quickly discontinued, but not before cementing its place as one of the most tragically misunderstood and oddly endearing cars in modern history. Today, the Aztek exists as a strange curiosity in the car world, one that no one will ever forget, even if they'd like to. The Pontiac Aztek, with all its awkwardness and clunky design, remains one of the most iconic failures in automotive history. It was the car that aimed to be different, but in doing so, it made one glaring mistake. It forgot that cars need to be attractive too. The 1978 AMC Pacer Wagon remains one of the most divisive and perplexing vehicles ever to roll off an American assembly line. Originally conceived as a cutting-edge compact car, the Pacer quickly became a symbol of the era's misguided ambitions. AMC, with its financial struggles and desire to carve out a unique identity, envisioned the Pacer as a futuristic, forward-thinking vehicle. However, what they ended up with was a quirky, strange, and fundamentally flawed design that caused many to scratch their heads and ask, what were they thinking? To say the Pacer wagon was unconventional would be an understatement. The car's defining characteristic was its massive, almost cartoonish, fishbowl-like windows. These vast expanses of glass wrapped around the sides and back of the car, making it feel less like a compact vehicle and more like a glass terrarium on wheels. Designed to give passengers an all-around view of their surroundings, the windows became a hallmark of the Pacer's oddball charm, but also its biggest flaw. Instead of offering a sense of openness and light, the enormous glass surfaces caused the car's interior to heat up like an oven on sunny days. One owner lamented, "It was like driving a greenhouse. I'd sweat just looking at it." This attempt at visibility ended up feeling more oppressive than liberating, creating a space that was uncomfortably bright and hot rather than open and airy. Adding to the vehicle's perplexing design was the awkwardly proportioned body. The Pacer's bulbous, wide shape made it look as though it had been inflated beyond its intended size, especially when compared to the sleeker, more traditionally designed cars of the 1970s. The awkwardness didn't end there, though. The body was asymmetrical, one of the most notable quirks being that one door was longer than the other. The mismatch in the door lengths felt like an intentional design oversight, making the car appear off-kilter. It was a car that seemed to have no clear identity, caught somewhere between being futuristic and hopelessly dated. The wagon version of the Pacer, introduced in 1978, was a design disaster that only compounded the awkwardness. While the Pacer Coupe had been unusual, the wagon variant was downright perplexing. Instead of enhancing the original Pacer's strange proportions, the added length made the car appear even more distorted, as if AMC was trying to create a family car, but ended up with something that belonged more in a cartoon than a driveway. The extended rear end did nothing to help its aesthetic issues, and the added cargo space only emphasized the awkward mismatch of form and function. What was intended to be a practical family car quickly became a symbol of misguided design choices. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Pacer was its attempt at being futuristic and space-age beyond, which only highlighted how out of touch it was with the market. AMC was trying to capture the optimism of the 70s, a time when the idea of the future was tied to sleek, shiny, space-age design. They wanted to make a car that represented the forward-thinking, technological future of the automotive industry. Instead, the Pacer turned out to be a bizarre, almost comically over-designed vehicle that seemed more like a cartoonish relic from a past era than a vehicle that was meant to push boundaries. While the Pacer's exterior was undeniably strange, its interior wasn't much better. Inside, the cabin was as quirky as the car's exterior. The space was cramped and unusually shaped, with the massive glass windows providing little shelter from the sun. The dashboard was simplistic and crude, offering little in terms of user-friendly design or comfort. The seats were functional but lacked the quality and refinement one would expect from a car that was supposed to be aiming for the future. The strange combination of practicality and weirdness led to an interior that was difficult to love and even harder to justify in terms of comfort. The Pacer wasn't just an eyesore, it was a failure in terms of performance as well. The car came with a variety of engine options, including a 3.8-liter inline-six, but none of them offered particularly thrilling performance. The Pacer's sluggish acceleration and handling made it a less than desirable choice for those seeking a dynamic driving experience. As a compact car, it should have been nimble, but instead, it felt cumbersome and clunky. The overall driving experience was underwhelming, a far cry from the futuristic driving experience AMC promised. Despite these shortcomings, the Pacer found a small following of loyal fans who appreciated it for its oddball charm. For many, it became a symbol of automotive experimentation gone awry, a car that tried to do something different but couldn't quite pull it off. It was both an attempt at innovation and a cautionary tale of how not to design a vehicle.